The hall was built to make visitors feel small. That was the point. The Grand Conclave Hall on Kelarath Prime rose nearly 400 meters from the polished stone floor to the vaulted ceiling. Thousands of seats curved around a central platform in rings, each ring higher than the last, so that every species on the Galactic Council could look down at whoever stood in the middle. The architecture was not accidental. It was a message. You are below us. You have always been below us. You always will be. Ambassador Lyra Vasquez had read about this hall before she arrived. She had studied its history, its purpose, and the deliberate cruelty of its design. She had prepared herself for how it would feel to walk into it. But preparation and reality were two very different things. And when she stepped through the grand entrance doors and saw the full weight of the place pressing down on her, she took one slow breath, squared her shoulders, and kept walking. She was 44 years old. She had spent 20 of those years in diplomatic service. First for the European Union, then for the United Nations, and finally for the newly formed Earth Council, which had been created specifically to manage humanity's first contact with the wider galaxy. She spoke 6 languages fluently, and could get by in 4 more. She had negotiated trade agreements between nations that had been at war for centuries. She had sat across the table from warlords and presidents, and people who would have killed her without losing a night's sleep. She was not easily frightened, but the Conclave Hall was not trying to frighten her. It was trying to erase her, and there was a difference. The petition she carried had taken 3 years to prepare. It outlined humanity's case for full membership in the Galactic Council. It described Earth's population, its resources, its scientific achievements, its history, and its willingness to contribute to the broader galactic community. It was thorough and honest and carefully worded. The team that had written it included historians, diplomats, linguists, scientists, and 2 philosophers who had argued over a single sentence for 11 days. Vasquez believed in it completely. She walked to the central platform and stood at the podium. Her translator earpiece hummed quietly as the ambient sounds of the hall shifted and settled into something like silence. High above her, the delegates of 47 species watched. Some of them had eyes she could see. Many of them did not. She began to speak. She spoke for 20 minutes. She talked about Earth, about humanity's long and difficult history, about the wars they had fought, and the peace they had slowly, painfully built. She talked about what humans could offer the galactic community. She talked about shared futures and common ground. She chose every word with care. She meant every single one. When she finished, the hall was quiet. Then the High Chancellor of the Galactic Council rose from the central seat of the highest ring. His name was Vorithis Kelm, and he had led the council for 30 years. He was tall and thin, with pale silver skin and 4 arms, and he moved with the practiced ease of someone who had never once been told no. He looked down at Vasquez for a long moment without speaking. Then he began. He did not address her petition. He did not respond to her arguments. He did not engage with a single point she had made. Instead, he spoke about humanity the way one might describe a disease. He called humans chaotic and violent. He called them primitive. He said their emotions made them dangerous, and their ambition made them unpredictable. He said the galaxy had survived for thousands of years without them, and would continue to do so. He said that allowing humanity into the council would be like inviting fire into a library. He spoke for 8 minutes. Then he gave a signal. What happened next was recorded by every camera in the hall and transmitted across the galactic communication network in real time. It was watched by billions of beings on hundreds of worlds. On Kelarath Prime, it was called the Rite of Dismissal, a tradition reserved for those the council considered beneath contempt. It had not been used in over 200 years. 2 guards stepped onto the platform. They carried a device that Vasquez did not recognize until it was too late. There was a sound like a held breath. And then there was light. And then there was nothing. The council expected protests. They expected outrage. They expected humanity to send messages, to demand explanations, to threaten legal action through whatever interspecies bodies they could find. This was how lesser species responded when they were put in their place. They made noise, they cried out, and then eventually, they became quiet, and did what they were told. Instead, Earth went silent. Not the silence of grief. Not the silence of fear. The footage had reached every screen on Earth, and in every human colony within hours. There was grief, of course. There was rage. There were people weeping in the streets of 100 cities. There were vigils and protests, and voices crying out for justice in every language humans had ever spoken. But from the governments, from the military, from the Earth Council, from every official body that had the power to actually respond, there was nothing. No statement, no press conference, no message to the Galactic Council. Just silence. In the UN war chamber deep beneath Geneva, the Secretary-General of Earth, a woman named Adaeze Okafor, sat at the head of a long table, surrounded by the joint chiefs of every major military power on the planet. She did not speak for a long time. She looked at the footage on the screen in front of her. She watched it once, from beginning to end, without expression. Then she set down her glass. She turned to the generals and admirals around her. She said, "Begin Directive Omega." No one at the table hesitated. No one asked for clarification. They had all read the directive. They had all hoped, in the quiet parts of themselves, that they would never have to use it. The Galactic Council gave humanity 3 days to respond. Then 5, then 10, then 30. Nothing came. This confused the Council's diplomatic corps more than anything else could have. They had prepared for anger. They had prepared for threats, for legal challenges, for hysterical broadcasts demanding justice. They had even prepared, quietly and with some distaste, for the possibility that humanity might attempt some kind of symbolic military gesture. A single ship crossing into Council space, perhaps. Something they could swat aside and use as further proof of human recklessness. They had not prepared for silence. The High Chancellor Vorathis Kelm was not concerned. He had overseen the Council for 30 years, and had dealt with the outrage of lesser species before. They all went quiet eventually. Silence, in his experience, was the first step toward acceptance. He told his advisors that the humans were processing their grief. He told them that the primitive species always needed time to understand their place in the order of things. He told them to be patient. His chief intelligence analyst, a thin and meticulous being named Sereth Volan, did not share his confidence. Sereth had spent 15 years studying humanity. She had read their history, all of it, and she had come away from that study with a feeling she could not quite name, but which sat in the base of her skull like a cold stone. She had tried to explain it to the Chancellor once. She had told him that humans were not like other species, that they had a particular relationship with catastrophe that made them unpredictable in ways that most species were not. The Chancellor had thanked her for her report and moved on to other matters. Now Sereth sat in her office and watched the intelligence feeds from human space and felt that cold stone in their skull grow heavier by the day. The human communication networks had gone dark. Not completely. Civilian traffic still moved. Personal messages, entertainment feeds, ordinary life continuing on the surface. But the governmental and military channels had switched to encrypted formats so dense that the Council's best codebreakers could not crack them. Human merchant ships were returning to port. Every human embassy on every neutral world had been quietly, politely evacuated, the staff thanking their hosts and packing their belongings and leaving without explanation. And then there was the shipyard data. The Council had spy networks in human space, as they did in all the space around them. They were good networks, carefully maintained, and they had provided reliable information for decades. What they were reporting now did not make sense. The human shipyards, which the Council had always considered laughably inefficient, were running at full capacity. Not just the major ones, all of them, including the ones in asteroid belts and deep space stations that had been listed in Council intelligence reports as minor, secondary, practically irrelevant. They were all running, at the same time, in perfect coordination. Sareth pulled up the production estimates and stared at them for a long time. Then she requested access to older files, records going back 30 years. What she found made the cold stone in her skull turn into something closer to ice. The humans had been building for decades, not openly, not in a way that had triggered any of the Council's monitoring protocols, because the construction had been spread across so many locations, each one individually unremarkable, that no single data point had raised a flag. But taken together, across 30 years, the pattern was unmistakable. Someone had designed it that way, deliberately. Someone had understood, 30 years ago, that humanity might one day need a military capability that the galaxy did not know existed. The program had a name. She found it buried in an intercepted communication from 6 years ago, a single reference that had been flagged as low priority and forgotten in a database. 2 words, the Warsmith Doctrine. She wrote her report and sent it to the Chancellor that same night. She flagged it as urgent. She included every piece of supporting data she had. She wrote, in the final paragraph, words that she chose very carefully. We have made a serious error in our assessment of this species, and I urge the Council to pursue immediate diplomatic resolution, before the situation becomes one we cannot control. He set it aside, and attended 3 other meetings before sending a brief reply. Noted. Thank you. Continue monitoring. On Earth, the silence continued. But it was not the silence of grief, or fear, or confusion. It was the silence of a species that had made a decision, and was moving, quietly and with great purpose, to carry it out. Reservists reported to stations across every human colony world. These were not career soldiers, most of them. They were farmers and engineers, and teachers and doctors and construction workers, who had trained on weekends and during annual leave for years, who had kept their certifications current and their gear maintained, and who had told their families that it was just a precaution, just in case. Probably nothing would ever come of it. Now they came, without announcement, without fanfare, without any visible panic. They came because they had been called, and because they had promised they would come when called, and humans at their core kept their promises. Ships launched from asteroid belt shipyards, in numbers that the Council's spy networks struggled to count. Many of them were classes that had never appeared in any intelligence report, vessels that had been designed and built entirely in the dark, their specifications known only to the engineers who had made them and the commanders who would fly them. Then, on the 32nd day of silence, humanity sent a single transmission to the Galactic Council. It was not long. It was not emotional. It contained exactly 14 words, translated precisely into High Kelarath, so that nothing could be lost. You burned our diplomat. We are coming. Do not mistake mercy for weakness. In the council chamber, when the message was read aloud, there was a long silence. Then several of the delegate species began talking at once, demanding responses, demanding military action, demanding the Chancellor explain what humanity actually meant. Admiral Greeth Vaz of the Council Armada laughed. He was a large being, well-decorated, confident in the force he commanded. 600 warships, the combined might of 47 civilizations. Humanity had, by his best estimates, perhaps a few dozen operational vessels and a population that had never fought a real war in space. He laughed, and shook his head, and said that the Council had nothing to worry about. Sareth Volan sat at the back of the chamber, and did not laugh. She was already working on evacuation plans. The Voreth Corridor was a narrow band of navigable space between 2 dense asteroid fields, and it was the fastest route between human territory and the heart of the Galactic Council. Admiral Greeth Vaz knew this. He had chosen it deliberately. If the humans were coming, this was where they would come, and this was where he would stop them. He positioned his 600 ships in a formation that had been used by the Council Armada for 200 years. A wide crescent, designed to catch any approaching force and fold around it from both sides. It was a proven formation. It had never failed. He waited. The first human ships appeared on long-range sensors 14 hours before they arrived. Greeth Vaz looked at the numbers and thought there was an error in the data. He asked his sensor operator to run the scan again. The numbers did not change. 2,117 human vessels were approaching the Voreth Corridor. Vaz sat in his command chair and looked at the number for a long time. Then he ordered his formation to hold. 600 against 2,000 was not good odds by any measure, but the council's ships were larger and better armed, or so he believed, and he had the advantage of position. He told himself these things. He told his officers these things. He watched the human fleet come closer on the display screen, and he held his formation, and he waited. He had made a mistake that would cost him everything, and the mistake was this. He had assumed that humans fought the way everyone else fought. In most galactic military doctrine, space battles were fought at long range, with clearly defined lines of engagement, and understood protocols. You declared your position, you signaled your intent, you gave the other side a chance to stand down before the shooting started. There were rules, unwritten but universally followed, that governed how civilized species made war. It kept battles from becoming massacres. It gave everyone involved a way to step back from the edge if they needed to. Humans had no interest in these rules, not because they were cruel, but because they had studied military history across thousands of years of their own warfare. And they had learned something that most species had not. The rules of war were written by the winners. And winners were not the ones who fought by the rules. They were the ones who changed the rules before the other side realized the game had changed. The human fleet did not approach in a single mass. It split, far out, into 7 separate groups, each one moving on a different approach vector, each one timed to arrive at slightly different moments, each one carrying a different tactical purpose. The central force came straight through the corridor, fast and loud, drawing the crescent formation's attention. The flanking forces came from angles that the asteroid fields should have made impossible, pushing through gaps that the Council's charts said didn't exist. They existed. Human survey ships had mapped them quietly, months ago. The battle lasted 9 hours. In the first hour, the human central force absorbed the Council's opening fire without breaking formation. Their shields were stronger than anything in the intelligence reports, built on a principle that the Council's engineers had not developed yet. They took the hits, and they kept coming, and they returned fire with weapons that burned hotter and faster than anything Vaz had ever seen. In the second hour, the flanking forces arrived. The crescent formation, designed to wrap around a single approaching enemy, found itself being wrapped around instead. The two ends of it hit from the sides before the captains there could respond. Ships that tried to turn to face the flanking threat exposed themselves to the central force. Ships that held position were hit from 2 directions at once. In the 5th hour, Vaz ordered a retreat to a secondary position. The human fleet did not let them reach it. They moved faster than his projections said they should, cutting off the retreat routes with a precision that felt personal, like whoever was commanding the humans had read his mind. In the 7th hour, human marines boarded the Council flagship. This was perhaps the thing that terrified the surviving Council crews most. Space warfare, in galactic doctrine, was a thing of ships and weapons fire and distance. It was rare, and considered almost uncivilized, for one species to physically board another's vessel and fight them in the corridors. It felt too intimate, too savage. The Council Armada had almost no training for it. The humans had trained for nothing else. They came through the hull at 17 different points simultaneously. They moved in small teams, fast and coordinated, using the ship's own layout against its defenders, cutting communications, securing engineering, moving always toward the command deck with the relentless efficiency of people who had drilled this exact scenario 10,000 times. The Council crew aboard the flagship outnumbered the boarding Marines 3-1. It didn't matter. The flagship fell in 90 minutes. In the 9th hour, what remained of the Council Armada broke. Not a tactical retreat, not a repositioning, a break, sudden and complete. Ships scattering in every direction, formation discipline gone, every captain making their own decision about survival. In 200 years of operation, the Council Armada had never broken. Vaz, transmitting from a lifeboat, watched it happen on a small screen and could not find words for what he was feeling. The Vorith corridor belonged to humanity. The human fleet held its position. It did not pursue the fleeing Council ships. It did not fire on vessels that were running. It held the corridor, and it waited. And that restraint was, in its own way, more frightening than the attack had been. It meant that the humans were not fighting out of rage. They were not swinging blindly. They were being precise. They were doing exactly what they had decided to do. Nothing more, and nothing less. Greeth Vass reached a council relay station 6 hours after the battle ended. The first thing he did was send a message to the Chancellor. It was longer than most military dispatches, because Greeth Vass felt strongly that whoever read it needed to understand something that did not show up in the casualty numbers. He wrote, "They do not fight to win. They fight to destroy. There is a difference, and we did not understand it until it was too late." He sent the message. Then he sat in the small station's common room, and for the first time in 30 years of military service, Admiral Greeth Vass of the Council Armada was genuinely afraid. The Galactic Council had always fought its wars on one front at a time. This was not laziness. It was doctrine, refined over thousands of years of interspecies conflict. Fighting on one front allowed you to concentrate your strength. It allowed you to negotiate from a position of power on the other fronts. It allowed your economy and your civilian population to continue functioning while your military handled the problem. Every major species in the Council had fought this way. Every military academy on every Council world taught this way. It was considered the rational approach to war. Humanity opened 12 fronts simultaneously. On the same day, at the same hour, timed with a precision that the Council's own admirals would later describe as almost supernatural. Human fleets entered the home systems of 12 different Council member species. Not to destroy, not yet, but to establish orbital blockades so complete and so fast that the targeted worlds barely had time to understand what was happening before it was done. No ships in, no ships out, no communication except on frequencies the humans controlled. The Council's military commanders convened an emergency session and discovered in real time the full horror of fighting a species that refused to let you breathe. Every plan they made assumed they could pull resources from somewhere. Every tactical response they considered required moving ships from one location to another. But everywhere they looked, humans were already there. 12 blockades, a corridor seized, an armada broken. They had no reserves they could safely move. They had no front they could strip to reinforce another. They were being held completely still. This was not an accident. Humanity's strategic planners had spent 30 years studying the Council's military doctrine, its logistics chains, its fleet positioning, its political relationships between member species. They had found the pressure points, the places where the Council's system was rigid and could not flex. And then they had pressed every single one of them at once. While the blockades held the Council in place, the Ashwalkers went to work. The soldiers of humanity's special operations units, the ones who operated behind enemy lines and small teams, who moved fast and quiet and hit hard and disappeared before anyone knew they had been there. They had named themselves after the ambassador, after Lyra Vasquez, who had walked into the conclave hall and burned there, and whose death had set all of this in motion. They wore a small mark on their armor, a flame, simple and black, and they did not talk about it much because they did not need to. The Ashwalkers moved through Council space doing 3 things. First, they targeted military infrastructure, fuel depots, communication relays, repair stations, the unglamorous machinery of war that an armada needed to keep itself running. They did not fight pitched battles. They arrived where they were not expected, did what they came to do, and left before a response could be organized. Council supply chains began to develop holes that couldn't be patched fast enough. Second, they made contact with the species the Council had kept under its thumb for generations. The galaxy was not made up only of the 47 Council members. There were smaller civilizations, younger ones, species that had been denied membership, or been given membership in name only, while the powerful species took what they wanted from their worlds. These beings had their own grievances, their own histories of being dismissed and exploited and talked down to. The Ashwalkers came to them not as conquerors, but as equals, and they brought a simple message. We are fighting the ones who did this to you too. You do not have to fight with us, but if you want to, we will fight beside you. Many of them said yes. Third, everywhere the Ashwalkers went they delivered the same words, in the local language to whoever was listening. We are not here for your territory. We are here for your surrender. Not your defeat. Your surrender. There is a difference, and when this is over you will understand what it means. On Kelarath Prime itself, the human fleet established a blockade that was total and elegant, and in its own way a piece of art. Every exit vector from the planet's gravitational system was covered. Every relay station in the system was dark. High Chancellor Vorithus Keln found himself for the first time in his long political life, unable to communicate freely with the council he led. He sent 17 ceasefire requests through what channels he had left. Each one was returned, unopened. Not rejected, not refused, returned. It was a message as clear as any words. You do not get to negotiate the terms of what happens next. Not yet. Not until we are ready. In the council chamber, with half its member species blockaded and the other half paralyzed with fear, with the armada broken and the supply chains bleeding, the debates grew desperate. Some delegates argued for total resistance. Some argued for immediate, unconditional surrender. Some argued that this was all a misunderstanding, and that surely the humans would listen to reason if the right approach was found. They argued for days, going in circles, unable to agree on anything. They could not agree because they did not understand what they were dealing with. They had always believed that war was, at its heart, a negotiation, that every conflict had a price, and if you found the price and paid it, the fighting stopped. They had always been right before. Humanity was not fighting for a price. Humanity was fighting for something much older and much harder to put a number on. They were fighting for the woman who had walked into a hall and spoken honestly and been burned alive for it. They were fighting for the principle that what had been done could not simply be paid for and forgotten. They were fighting because some things, once done, require a reckoning. And the reckoning was here. Several of the smaller council species, the ones who had seen clearly from the beginning what the Ashwalker message meant, began quiet diplomatic contact with human representatives on neutral ground. They came not to beg for mercy, but to ask a real question. What does humanity want from us, specifically, when this is over? What would peace actually look like? The human diplomats who met with them were patient and specific and honest. They described what they wanted. They described what they didn't want. They were not demanding empire. They were not demanding tribute or territory or the humiliation of defeated enemies. The species who heard this were surprised, and then they were something else entirely. They were hopeful. High Chancellor Keln stood at the window of his palace on Kelarath Prime and watched the lights of the human ships in orbit, steady and cold above his world. He had spent 30 years telling himself that strength was the only language that mattered, that the powerful made the rules and the weak accepted them, that this was simply the way of things, how the galaxy worked, how it had always worked. He watched the lights and understood, finally, what he had done. He had poked something ancient, something that had survived tens of thousands of years of killing itself, and had come out the other side, not broken, but sharpened. Something that remembered every lesson it had ever learned about war and power, and what happens when the powerful push the wrong people too far. He had poked it, and now it was here, outside his window, patient and purposeful, and not going anywhere. For the first time in 30 years, Vorithus Keln was afraid. The war ended on a Tuesday. Not with a great battle, not with a final desperate stand, or a spectacular military victory. It ended the way most things end, quietly and without ceremony, in a moment when everyone involved finally understood that it was over. 43 of the 47 council member species had either formally surrendered or sent representatives to meet with human diplomats in the weeks before. The remaining 4 had gone dark inside their blockades, their governments collapsed or paralyzed, their populations quietly waiting to see what came next. 6 months had passed since the execution of Ambassador Lyra Vasquez. 6 months. In that time, the most powerful military and political alliance in the known galaxy had been brought to a complete halt by a species that had been dismissed, mocked, and finally murdered for daring to ask for membership. The Council's intelligence agencies would spend years trying to understand exactly how it had happened, how the Warsmith Doctrine had gone undetected for 3 decades, how the human fleet had been built and hidden in plain sight, How a civilization that the galaxy had considered primitive had turned out to be more prepared for war than anyone who had studied them. The answer, when those analysts finally wrote their reports, was simple, though it did not feel simple when they wrote it. Humans read their own history. They read it carefully, all of it, including the parts that were painful, and the parts that were shameful, and the parts that showed what happened to civilizations that were naive about power. They had done this for thousands of years, passing the lessons forward from one generation to the next. And the lesson they had passed forward most consistently, the one that sat at the heart of the Warsmith doctrine, was this: when you go among the powerful for the first time, go in peace. But know, clearly and without illusion, what you will do if peace is not offered in return. Lyra Vasquez had gone in peace. Now her daughter came to finish what she had started. Commander Elena Vasquez was 31 years old, and she wore her Ashwalker armor when she walked into the Grand Conclave Hall on Kelarath Prime, with the small black flame on her shoulder, and the careful, steady expression of someone who has decided exactly what she is going to do, and is not afraid. She had been offered a diplomatic uniform. She had thanked them politely, and declined. She had been offered a ceremonial guard of 200 soldiers. She had thanked them, and said she would bring 4 people she trusted, and that was enough. The hall was the same hall, the same 400 meters of vaulted stone, the same rings of seats curving upward into the vast space above, the same central platform where her mother had stood and spoken and died. They had cleaned it thoroughly in the months since. Every surface was polished. There was no mark, no stain, nothing visible to indicate what had happened here. Elena Vasquez walked to the platform and stood exactly where her mother had stood. The delegates of 39 species were present in person. The remaining 8 attended by transmission, their worlds either blockaded or too damaged by the conflict for safe travel. All of them watched in silence as she took her place. They had expected something theatrical, perhaps, an angry speech, a list of demands delivered with fury, a victor's cruelty dressed up in official language. She opened a folder and began to read. The terms were precise and they were long, and they took 40 minutes to read aloud in full. But their shape was clear within the first few minutes, and as that shape became apparent, a murmur moved through the hall that was unlike any sound a galactic diplomatic chamber had heard before. It was not fear, it was not relief, it was something closer to confusion, the particular confusion of beings who had prepared themselves for the worst, and were struggling to understand why the worst was not coming. Humanity was not claiming territory. Not a single planet, not a single star system, not a single space station. They were not demanding tribute. They were not demanding that council species limit their military capability or submit to human oversight. They were not demanding apologies, though several species had offered them. What they were demanding was harder than any of those things, because it required change rather than payment. The Galactic Council would be restructured. Fully. Every species with a population above a certain threshold would receive equal voting membership, regardless of how long they had been in the galaxy, regardless of their military power, regardless of their economic contribution. Smaller civilizations would receive representation through a new secondary chamber. The old hierarchy, the careful arrangement of powerful species at the top and everyone else arranged below them, would be dissolved. Every diplomatic envoy from any recognized species would be protected under a new body of galactic law with real enforcement mechanisms, funded jointly by all members. Harming a diplomat would constitute an act of war against every species that had signed the accord. And there would be a trial. Not a human trial, a galactic one, conducted by an independent bench of judges drawn from species that had not been involved in the conflict. High Chancellor Varathus Keln and the 11 council members who had voted to approve the right of dismissal would stand before this court and answer for what had been done in the Grand Conclave Hall 6 months ago. They would receive legal representation. They would have the right to speak in their own defense. The proceedings would be transparent and public and available to every being in the galaxy. They would be treated, in other words, with the basic dignity that had been denied to the woman whose death had started all of this. The murmur in the hall became something else as Elena finished reading. Several delegates were speaking quietly to their advisors. A few were completely still. One, the representative of a small species from the outer reaches that had been a council member for 60 years and had spent most of those years being ignored and talked over, was openly weeping from something she could not immediately name, but which felt when she reached for it, very much like the first deep breath after a very long time underwater. Elena closed her folder. She looked up at the rings of delegates above her, the same view her mother had seen, and she did not speak for a moment. Then she said, "These terms are not negotiable. They are not a starting position. They are what happens now. If you have questions about specific implementation, my team will remain on Kelarath Prime for the next 30 days to work through the details. If you have objections to the principles, I would ask you to think carefully about what the last 6 months have shown you, and whether your objections are ones you truly want to pursue." She paused. She said, "My mother came to this hall because she believed in the possibility of a galaxy where every species had a voice and every life had value. She believed that strongly enough to come here alone and stand where I am standing, and ask you honestly and without threat to be better than you had been." You answered her with fire. Another pause, shorter this time. She said, "We have answered you in kind. Now we are done with fire. From this day, we build." High Chancellor Varathis Keln was arrested that afternoon by officers of the new Joint Galactic Authority, peacefully and without incident. He said nothing during the arrest. He had not said much in the weeks since the blockade had begun. Some of his advisors had told reporters later that in those final weeks he had simply sat at his window and looked at the human ships in orbit and thought about what he had done. The new Galactic Council held its first session 3 weeks later. Its first resolution was called the Vasquez Accord. Elena Vasquez did not attend the signing ceremony. She was already on a transport back to Earth, sitting in a small cabin, looking out at the stars moving past the window. She thought about her mother, who had believed in something hard enough to walk into a room full of beings who hated her and speak honestly anyway. She thought about the 47 species that would now have to learn to share power with beings they had spent centuries looking down on. She thought about the Ashwalkers still out there in the dark, coming home. She thought about all of it for a long time. Then she closed her eyes, and for the first time in 6 months, she slept.